Friends, thank you very much for joining us. James, very good to see you.
Good to see you too, Ian. Yeah.
Are you enjoying the exciting summer and the exciting football results and all that kind of thing?
Oh, yes, indeed. Yes, because, of course, football is my favourite game.
Friends, there was a bit of a note of sarcasm there. Yeah. But James, while we're informing our loyal viewers as to your sarcastic humour, just need to remind them of the 4 things we love them to do.
Yes. We do love you to click like on the videos. That's great. Do subscribe to the channel. That's great. You get an email about new videos coming out. Do share on the social media. That's always good, whichever your preferred social media is. And do comment on the videos if you've got anything to say. We always love getting that feedback and the questions and answers that people offer. Actually, they're fantastic.
Yeah, and sometimes people make comments and discuss it on YouTube itself, sometimes on the social media, wherever they've seen it. So
so again, different discussions going in different places, which is always interesting.
We do. Yeah, we go. Now, we continue to be in this sort of open season, the ordinary season, working through Mark's Gospel. So which week have we got to, and which is our passage this week?
Yeah, we're on Trinity 6, and we are following on actually from last week, we've got Mark 6, 1 to 13 today. And we're in a few weeks when we're looking essentially sequentially through Mark. So that's quite a good thing. Unfortunately, the way the lectionary slices and dices doesn't quite fit in with Mark's structural scheme. So that's something we just need to be aware of.
Now, is that the fault of the lectionary, or is it the fault of our friend Stephen Langton, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury in the 13th century, who did this? Because I don't want to defend the lectionary here, but I want to say, well, I can understand why the lectionary has done what it is, because we've actually got what some commentators would say in the first 6 verses here is the closing section of this sort of ministry sequence from chapter 3 through to chapter 6. And it feels as though when we get to verse 7, and he called the 12 and began to send them out 2 by 2, we're actually into a new kind of ministry section here. Not least because it seems to me at the end of verse 6, and he went about the villages teaching. Seems to be interesting here. One of those kind of summary comments, kind of summary comments we find in Matthew and Luke, actually. In Matthew, where he says, and when he'd finished teaching all these things. So that is interesting.
Yeah, it is, absolutely. You do feel that the lectionary compilers might have been led astray by the chapter divisions, don't you? But it's quite interesting, this, isn't it? Because what we've got today is 2 stories which seem to be connected in some way, to some degree. We've got the story of Jesus in the synagogue in Nazareth, and then we've got the story of him sending out 2 by 2. But then the following week, next week, we've got the story of the beheading of John the Baptist. And then the week after that, we get the story of, the other sort of half of the story of Jesus sending out the 12. So when they come back and say, give them his report back. And that, of course, is part of one of these well-known Markan sandwiches or dovetails, where you've got the story of the sending out and as the bread, and you've got the story of the beheading of John the Baptist as the jam. So what we've got today is the first bit of the bread. Next week we have
quite bloody jam, really.
Then we have the very bloody jam next week, and then we have the final bit of bread the week after that. So you've got to sort of literally deconstruct your sandwich. To take all this in. So you miss the structural stuff from Mark if you're not careful. That's really the point, and it's good to have an eye on that, because I think actually of all Mark and dovetails, this one is particularly illuminating.
What it is, because of course this wonderful victorious, we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves, but the wonderful victorious, the disciples see the ministry happening, and they're sent out, then they come back and say how wonderful it is, and isn't God wonderful and powerful? And then you get this tragic story in the middle of, he was Jesus' predecessor John, significant ministry, and he's the one who's been beheaded. But just going back to our passage for this week, the other interesting thing about the structure is that because And I think this is why Ben Witherington, particularly in his commentary, says that, we've got the end of a section here, is that there is a kind of inclusio, a sort of bracketing in this section here, in the first half of chapter 6, with the beginning of this ministry section in chapter 3, which starts around the time when Jesus, his mother and brothers and sisters come to fetch him because I think he's gone crazy. Yeah. And it's not a very flattering portrayal of them there. We did talk about that then when we talked about that passage. And then here, again, we get a similar mention of them. And they seem to be counted as the people who are unbelieving in his hometown.
Yes, it's kind of like a big dovetail almost, isn't it? It's as you say, inclusio, and you've got this return of you've had this incredible conflict which Jesus brings about, which we mentioned I think in the earlier chapters, on chapters 2 and 3, and then there's this wonderful sort of ministry that goes on, which we've just been dealing with the last couple of weeks, and now we're back to this conflictual stuff. So conflict in Mark is never far away. There's always opposition to Jesus, and it comes from unexpected places. Sometimes, so it's an interesting. I think he's right. I think that's a really helpful way of understanding it.
So interesting that this dynamic ministry in the middle is bracketed around by people close to him not actually receiving it.
Extraordinary. And as we mentioned before, Jesus' family don't get a good press in Mark, do they?
No, they don't. No.
They really, really not, and so they're very consistently misunderstand him until after the resurrection. So
just looking at the text itself, it's interesting that we start in verse 1 with he went away from there and came to his hometown, which is quite interesting because we do notice that Mark makes these references to geography and movement. We've noticed, for instance, the 8 movements backwards and forwards across the lake. But it's interesting, he is making an observation. The healing of Jairus' daughter must have happened by the lakeside. Yes. We think probably around. I don't think we're told exactly where Jairus is synagogue leader of. We're assuming it's Capernaum.
Yeah, I think we do assume that, but I don't think it's actually explicit in the text.
No, it says it. But anyway, so he's by the lakeside.
Yeah.
And then he has to go away from there to come to his hometown, which is interestingly, Mark doesn't mention this, but of course it's Nazareth. And actually, the parallels in Luke mentions that this is Nazareth. So we know it's Nazareth. In fact, interestingly, Nazareth is only mentioned once in the whole of Mark's Gospel, right at the very beginning, where it says Jesus came from Nazareth. Yeah. There's an interesting contrast with the fourth Gospel, where ironically, when we think of that as a spiritual Gospel, the geographical references are more precise. Yes. So when Jesus goes from the lake to Nazareth, or to Cana, that John says, the fourth Gospel says, he went up. So he's actually, noting the fact you're going into the hills.
You're going into the hills, which is probably, 25 miles or so, I guess, away from Capernaum to Nazareth. So, we're in very different country here, very different territory, geographically, the whole feel of it. Anybody who's been to Nazareth knows that. It's
And on the Sabbath, he began to teach in the synagogue, which we might think is strange, but of course, actually, at the time, Nazareth was a small village, and Jesus was a very big name by now.
Absolutely, and it's interesting, isn't it, given that what happens later on in the story, that it appears that he's welcome to teach in the synagogue. I mean, that's as we mentioned, I think we mentioned in the past, the sort of superintendent of the synagogue, or the leader of the synagogue, it was their job to arrange the preachers, and clearly he thought that, and make sure that it was orthodox. So clearly they thought that Jesus was okay. But in fact, what happens is rather unexpected in that sense.
There's one little interesting detail there, and I'm not quite sure the significance of it, which is at the end of verse 1, Mark says, and his disciples followed him. I'm not quite sure what the significance of that is, but I mean, we wouldn't be surprised about that, but it's interesting that he just sort of notes that.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? I mean, it's the job of disciples to follow. But it is interesting. I don't know whether that kind of sets us up for the second half of the reading, where he sends them out 2 by 2. Because that may be, and also I think there's a link here, perhaps, with when he chooses the disciples, because what he chooses when he appoints them to be with him and to be sent out by him, doesn't he? So that's kind of in this. That's way back in chapter 3. So what we have here is the enacting of of those things. They have been with him, is what Mark's telling us.
Yes.
And then they will be sent out, so they will come to the fullness of what it means to be a disciple. There's a process going on here, maybe.
Yeah, yeah. He teaches, and then the text says, many who heard him were astonished. Now, I think actually from the grammar, it seems to me it's slightly ambiguous. Is it many of those? Is it a partitive? Is it many of those who heard him were astonished? Or is it many heard him and they were astonished? I'm not sure. I don't think it makes that much difference.
No. But it is ambiguous in the Greek, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. But the language of astonishment is really interesting because it's a very, very dramatic word, ekplesso. It means absolutely, well, in the dictionary definition, filled with amazement to the point of being overwhelmed. They just can't understand. I mean, it is really interesting, the dynamic here, isn't it? Where did this man get these things? Where is this wisdom? How are such mighty works done by his hands? Is this not the carpenter? I mean, the first thing to observe is how there's just this really natural human thing that it's really hard to accept the person who you knew and you saw grow up and you saw the ordinary life they lived.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's also instructive, isn't it, that even when you are blown away by the great deeds, the great preaching, whatever it is, that is not a guarantee that you will accept the identity of the person for who he is. And so, that's I think that's a very important thing for us to remember. That in a sense, I suppose there's two things going on in the whole of the scriptural tradition. I mean, one is your own choice about what you decide about this person. The other is the action of the Holy Spirit in you to bring about faith, isn't it? Yeah.
And there is a dynamic as well, I find, because I travel and speak quite a lot.
Yes.
It is interesting. I mean, there's a natural human dynamic, which is that if you're in a local church, for example, it's much easier to hear something from a guest preacher than it is to hear it from your own vicar. It
is. Having been in my current post 18 years, say no more. And what is really frustrating, actually, and is when you've said it consistently over the years you've been there, and then a guest preacher turns up and says it, and suddenly everybody's telling you that it's a kind of new thing that they've discovered. But that keeps us all humble, so that's very important.
It does.
Yeah.
And like the Murphys, you're not bitter.
No, not bitter. Not bitter.
Not bitter at all.
And then we have this very interesting verse, don't we? I mean, it's interesting what he says, what deeds of power. And, of course, we know if you read the whole of the passage, you know that he didn't do many deeds of power there. So this seems to be like the report of deeds of power, probably, that they've heard. But then we go into this really interesting bit about, is this not this the carpenter? And we get all this list of names. Now, why do you think we get all the names of the brothers of Jesus? That's such an interesting thing, isn't it? It
is, and we don't get the sisters aren't named. Or his sister's not here with us. I mean, I think one of the obvious explanations is that we know that from Paul's writings, actually, that I think it's hinted at in 1 Corinthians, where Paul is talking about who he can take with him. 1 Corinthians 9, verse 5, Paul says, do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? So actually, by 1 Corinthians, it's clear that Jesus' brothers have actually come to faith, but they're clearly not now, because they seem to be on the side of those who are sceptical. So I think I'm mostly persuaded by Richard Baucham's theory about names in general, which is that the primary reason you find names in the New Testament is because they became well known in the early community, so that they're referred to by name. And although quite a lot is made sometimes of some people who are named and some people who are unnamed, as though there's a power dynamic going on here, I think actually the explanation that they became well known is more persuasive.
It does seem much more plausible, doesn't it? So it's fascinating that this family of Jesus, who, as we said, and do not get a good press in Mark, do actually come to faith post-resurrection and are influential, perhaps, and certainly well known in the early church. So, I mean, James.
A little detail here in the text, which I think is really fascinating, which is they talk about the mighty works done by his hands. Now, in one way, that's just a sort of simple circular expression, but they then go on to say, is this not? Well, now I'm looking at the ESV here, and it says carpenter, which of course isn't a very good translation. It's a traditional one. But the word tectone there means someone who's good with their hands. So
Yeah.
a
Oh,
craftsman.
that's very interesting.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, usually it's woodwork.
Yeah.
Usually it's not a metalworker. Usually it's someone where rather than casting things as you do with metalwork, you actually need to carve them. So it'd be with wood or with stone.
Fine.
In
Yeah.
fact, one of the commentaries says that the word has even been used of a surgeon who performs
Ah,
surgery carefully with their hands.
right.
So it's just, I just thought it was fascinating that they know mighty works done by his hands, and here we have the craftsman. So we might say, but they know Jesus is good with his hands, but they're not sure they want him to use his hands to do these sort of things amongst them.
No, they know what they do want it. They want him to fix their agricultural equipment and their buildings, but they don't want him. Yeah,
Yes.
fascinating, isn't it? Yeah, yeah.
It's also just. So I was going to say, it's a little bit of background to the context here, which is that he works with his father, who's not mentioned, of course.
Yeah.
So is this not the carpenter? In fact, the parallel Matthew said, is this not the son of the carpenter? Now,
Yeah.
there's various speculations about what's going on there. I think the simplest explanation is that Joseph, probably being older than Mary, might well have died.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's why he's not mentioned. But this could have been, we know that Sepphoris nearby, there was a lot of building work going on. And if there's a building business, a bit like with James and John the fishermen, where they have a business, they've got a number of boats, they've got hired men. Jesus here would have been part of a significant family.
Yeah.
Maybe he would have been expected to take on the role of head of the family, and therefore they're looking down on him a bit because he's gone off on this itinerant ministry. So,
Yeah.
but it would have been a well-known and significant family in the village. What was a village then?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and but that phrase, that whole thing about Joseph not being here and Jesus being described as the son of Mary is interesting. I think is it only place in the New Testament where Jesus is actually called the son of Mary? I think it is, and don't think there are any other places. So,
Friends, viewers, you need to comment below. Have we got that right?
yeah, if you call us out on that if we've got that one wrong, but yeah, it is interesting that, and I guess once again it's a reflection of Mary's prominent role in the early church. Yeah.
But apart from the fact that his family here are not a part of his ministry, so they're kind of sidelined. This is just again part we noticed in chapter 3 that there's this new redefinition of kinship. But the other thing which is extraordinary here is that he could do no mighty work except he laid hands on a few sick people and healed them. You know, that's all, just a few healings.
Yeah.
And he marvelled because of their unbelief. But the theological point here is that Jesus, there in the flesh, before them, respected, as it were, their disbelief, in that if they weren't expecting him to do a miracle, then he wasn't going to do one. Now that ties in with the comments particularly you made last week about the woman, your faith has healed you, and how the function of faith, not as a thing which is a good that you trade in exchange for healing, but that faith is you're holding your hands out as the thing where you accept what Jesus offers, and therefore you receive the healing, or you receive the miracle, you receive the deliverance, whatever it is. And here, because they haven't got their hands held out for anything, they don't want to receive it, he won't force it on them.
No, and interesting also that in terms of the piece that we're going on to in the second half of this reading, where Jesus tells the disciples as he sends them out, you know, if they don't receive you, just, you know, wipe the dust off your feet, shake the dust off your feet. That is actually exactly what he's doing here in his hometown, amongst his own family. So he's living the message that he's about to give to the disciples. He's setting them an example, actually, isn't he? Which is classic Jesus in teaching people. I also think there's an interesting connection. I mean, Mark cites Jesus saying that he's amazed at their unbelief, which clearly is a problem for the miracles. But the unbelief begins in offence, doesn't it? He says that it very clearly tells us that they took offence at him. And I wonder that the connection between people who take offence at Jesus and unbelief. You might say, well, that's an obvious connection. But I wonder if offence becomes a barrier to faith, which is...
Well, it is, and the word is scandalon, which means the stumbling block.
It's a stumbling
and of
block.
course, Jesus has said, blessed is he who does not stumble because of me.
Exactly.
And then again, that's an allusion to, in one of the Psalms, doesn't it, where it says they stumble.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Have I got that reference right? Okay, this is when we're going off the top of our head.
It's always dangerous. Yeah.
Well, it's language that Peter picks up, second chapter of the first letter of Peter.
Yeah.
Where he talks about cornerstone, and but some stumble against it.
Yeah, he does.
Those who don't believe. So we get to the second part here. He goes around the other villages teaching, because he goes to where he will be received. And then, as you say, he calls the 12, and then he begins to send them out two by two. Interesting that he began to send them out. This is, again, characteristic of Mark's style. He quite often uses these kind of inceptive imperfects, doesn't he?
He does. He loves that word began. In fact, it's the second time in this passage he's used it, because, of course, he used the same word in verse 2. It does create a sense of, this is almost an example of what he does constantly in his ministry, which is sending out the disciples. So he kind of began here to do it, but he kind of carried on doing this throughout the ministry. So you kind of get the sense that this is a kind of typical, like we had the typical day at the beginning of Mark of Jesus' ministry, where really, how did he fit all that into one day? This is another kind of situation where he feels like this is what Jesus does with those who follow him. And then, of course, the interesting connection there is when you get to the story of the beheading of John the Baptist, you get the story of the cost of discipleship. What you get here is the actions of discipleship, or the job of discipleship. So,
I need to correct my grammar. I said it was an inceptive imperfect. It's not. It's actually the verb archomai. It is to begin. It's actually a separate word.
Right,
begin with an infinitive.
Yeah, it is a separate word. Yeah.
Two by two.
Yeah.
There's lots of ideas around theories around the idea of why he's sending them out two by two.
Yeah.
The animals in the ark.
Yeah.
Two witnesses. Deuteronomy 17. Don't believe the testimony of one person, but ensure that two witnesses agree. So two people testifying to the kingdom, perhaps.
Yeah.
Some people would argue that it's the disciples, well, certainly with the 72, it's disciples and their wives, partners. So going
it could be. Yeah.
Ecclesiastes 4 was good for two to be together. They can encourage one another. But notice that interestingly, Paul follows a similar pattern, that Paul never goes on a missionary journey on his own. What he does, the one time he does, is in Acts 17 in Athens, and that's the place where his ministry bears no fruit.
Yeah.
Always with at least one other in a partnership.
Yeah.
Really fascinating that, we could spend a whole hour talking about just this little section of it, that they take nothing for the journey with them. Now, there's a slight tension here because Mark here is very absolute, and Matthew, I think, kind of nuances and says, well, they didn't take absolutely nothing with them at all, did they? So, But what the key significance is that they're not providing for themselves. The reason is the people they go to provide for them. Now, this is a really interesting dynamic in mission, isn't it? Whereas we think that very often, the history of missionary movements from the West is that you go with something, you bless people with the thing you've got, the practical skill, the medical skill or knowledge or teaching or whatever it is. Now, because they're grateful for you, you can, as it were, take advantage and then also preach the gospel. Whereas here, the dynamic is quite different, isn't it?
Quite different.
They've got a good thing that they want to bless people with, which is the good news of Jesus. And in return, people will give them food and accommodation and provision and shelter and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And we really need to hear that message. I think the other interesting thing about this list is if you read 8 and 9, it's a list of things not to take, but it includes two things that you should take, which is a staff and your sandals. That's really interesting in the sense that, because it alludes to other verses that we're familiar with. There is an allusion, I think, to the instructions around the Passover in Exodus, where they were to be ready with a staff and their sandals. So there's that sense of
ready to march off at speed.
Exactly, and ready to enter ready ultimately to enter the promised land.
Yeah.
But there are also other verses in the background here. Ephesians 6, the 6:15, which, where Paul talks about the having your feet shod with with readiness to proclaim the gospel of peace. So that feels like Paul is picking up on that idea there, doesn't it? And then Isaiah 52, perhaps, how beautiful are the feet of those who proclaim good news. So interesting, because obviously you're going to wear sandals. There's a sense, that made explicit in a list of all the negatives. I think that's quite interesting.
Yeah. Now, I haven't done research on this two tunics thing, but I've just on impulse. I think the two tunics thing is I would surmise. I don't know if you read on things, and dear viewers, if you've got a comment on this, do make a note below. But you have two tunics. You have a light tunic, but you also have your heavy cloak, which you need if you're going to sleep out of doors to keep you warm. So in other words, what he's saying is you must rely on the hospitality of the people you go to, and they will provide you with accommodation. That's the plan.
Ah, that's very interesting, isn't it? It reinforces that whole idea.
Yeah,
That's
do
really
that.
interesting.
Is that convincing? Sorry, that's just occurred to me on the moment. Just
It's a
looking at
very
the passage
convincing
again.
idea. Well, you always sound convincing, Ian, but it does on this occasion sound particularly convincing. Yes. Yeah.
Now, you've already mentioned this, but of course, then when you go to a place, and if they receive you, then you enter the place and you stay there. Now, I guess the thing about not moving around is so you don't play people off and try and get the best deal. You simply go to the people who receive you, whoever they are.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if they do not receive you and they will not listen to you, when you leave, shake the dust off your feet. Now, that seems to me is a very clear Old Testament allusion, which is that when people have left the Church of Israel and they've gone to be amongst the Gentiles, when they come back, they shake the dust off the feet because this is the Gentile dust and they go on to pollute the Promised Land.
Yeah.
So what is fascinating here is that we've seen in the previous passage Jesus, well, the end of this long thing where Jesus redefines the boundaries of kinship. So those who believe are his brother and mother and sisters and so on. Now he's actually redefining who Israel is, because instead of Israel being able to reside in the territory and you shake your dust off your feet when you re-enter the territory, effectively the people who won't receive Jesus and the news of the kingdom are, as it were, the new Gentiles.
Yeah.
So the Israel of God is now those who receive the message of the kingdom and Jesus.
Yes, absolutely. It is extraordinary, isn't it, when you think about it, that this is shaking the dust from a Jewish town.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Which you're treating them, those who have not received Jesus, even if they're Jews, you're treating them as though they were Gentiles.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a couple of other interesting details here. It is interesting, isn't it, that they went out, and although Jesus hasn't used this language, they've listened to him carefully because this is Jesus' message. They went out and proclaimed that people should repent.
Yeah, which is of course precisely what Jesus does in chapter 1. You repent, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. So and that's a strong theme in Mark, isn't it? The proclamation and repentance. So it's almost a shorthand for Mark telling us they did what Jesus did. I think.
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
The ministry is absolutely consistent. But then also they makes this distinction, don't they, between they cast out many demons and anointed with oil many who were sick and cured them. Mark makes a distinction between those two, as it were, ailments. Those two.
We shouldn't confuse them.
No, we shouldn't.
No, indeed. And I think this is the only place in the Gospels where the anointing with oil is mentioned.
Oh, in terms of healing ministry, as it were.
Yeah,
yes, of course.
It's mentioned in James,
James
absolutely. 5.
Yeah.
But this is the only place in the Gospels where there's
That's
anointing.
really fascinating. Yeah.
Well, it shows perhaps a sense of continuity of practice from the apostles themselves with Jesus into the next generation and the teaching.
Another of those pieces of evidence that the epistles draw on the original tradition of Jesus and teaching of Jesus, that they were entirely familiar with it and simply obeyed it.
Yeah. Now, in one sense, we ought to round this off carefully, but in another sense, we ought to leave our viewers hanging in suspense because, as you said, this is the first half of the
this is just
sandwich.
the bread.
It's the bread at the beginning, and then we'll get the meat. So, friends, we'll quickly remind you, don't forget to like the video, don't forget to make a comment, don't forget to subscribe, and do share it on social media if this has been useful for you or discussed on social media as well. And we are just going to leave you in suspense now because it's not until next week that we pick up the other half of this and the story that follows. So we'll see you next time. James, thank you very much. Look forward to seeing you next week.